Silence is the biggest enemy of mental and emotional well-being, making us feel isolated, like we're on our own, and increasing the stigma that already surrounds these issues. At Keeping Health in Mind, we long for people to talk about mental health and well-being, and to be free to worship, free to belong, and free to grow. I'm so delighted to be able to introduce our series of conversations, a chance to delve more fully into the world of mental health and church. And I hope and pray that they will encourage you, equip you, and answer some of your questions. So this is the first of our conversations for Keeping Health in Mind around church and mental health and mental well-being. And today I'm really so excited, Jane, that you've agreed to chat to me about mental health and church, and a little bit about what it means to be church for those who struggle with their mental health, and for those of us who maybe don't, but live alongside them in community as part of a family. And so, first of all, what does it mean to be the church for those who are marginalised on the edges of society, such as those who struggle with their mental well-being?
And of course that is where the church started, on the edges of society. And to begin with, the earliest Christians don't seem to have been people of great influence or power, and they seem to have been people who were very easily despised. It was called, by cultured Romans who were in charge of the world at that point, it was called a religion of slaves and women, because it appealed to people who had no stake in the way society was run in any other way. So it seems to be part of who the church is, to be there for people who are not comfortable in society as it is. That should be part of the DNA of the church. And from very early times we find the church just taking it for granted that they will care for each other and for people in need. So we find extraordinary stories, for example, of some of the big plagues that swept the Roman Empire in the first few Christian centuries. We find that church leaders were exhorting their church members to take care of their neighbours, whether they were Christians or not to run away and try and save themselves, but to take care of their neighbours. And their non-Christian neighbours began to notice that you were more likely to survive a plague if you lived next door to a Christian than if you didn't, which was one of those actually missional things. People began to think there's something unusual about Christians, that they care for needy people, and that carries on throughout church history. You see the first monasteries and hospitals being built by Christians specifically to serve people who had needs, because the assumption was that all of these people were people that God loved and desired to be in relationship with, and therefore Christians are called to demonstrate that in the way that we live. So it ought to be absolutely fundamental to what the church is, to care for people who are not comfortable in society in one way or another, the ones who are on the edges, on the margins.
So I'm fascinated by that link into our past as church, and how far back that heritage of caring for those who are right on the edges goes. And I know that in this country, mental health care very much started with people of faith. It was something that they just naturally picked up, and they noticed that it was those whose families didn't know how to care for them, who'd been abandoned sometimes by their support networks, who really needed the care and love of that early hospital for mental illnesses. And they noticed that that happened much more for those who were mentally unwell than it did for those who were physically unwell. And so naturally that work was picked up by the church at that time. And I wonder now whether we've lost some of that with how things have developed in our society, and how a lot of the way that people are cared for is taken away from faith communities, has somehow moved away. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about why that might have happened.
I mean, the theology of caring for people who are broken by the world is very powerful and profound theology, because because when God becomes human in Jesus Christ, he doesn't become an invulnerable human being. He becomes a very vulnerable human being who is actually beaten, tortured, killed, so that we know that humanity in the image of God doesn't have to be perfect. And I think that desire then to care for broken humanity, because we see the image of Jesus in those who are suffering, it ought to go very deep. And I think it's one of the things that we have, the Christian community has actually bequeathed to the wider society, so that we've actually sort of taught the civilization that that's what it is to be civilized, is to care for people when they need care. And in a way, therefore, particularly in this country, a lot of our understanding of the duty of the state is a duty of care for people who can't care for themselves. And I sort of wonder if, as the Christian church, we sort of feel, okay, now we've taught society how to do it, we won't bother with it anymore, and we're forgetting that lesson ourselves, which would be a real betrayal of our deepest being if we thought we could delegate that to other people. It's good to encourage the wider society to understand that it is a mark of a good society, is how you care for those who are in need. But that doesn't mean that the caring can be delegated simply to official organs of state. We have to continue to be involved, because that's what we are, that's who we are as church.
And so because that's who we are, and because that's what we do, what does it mean for us to be alongside people who may not be intact in the same way that they were before, who maybe have been broken by a severe mental illness, who maybe look at themselves and think, I can't recognise the person that I used to be, and I would love to find a way to get that back. Maybe they have questions around where God is in their identity at that time. How do you think we can be a community that incorporates those broken and fragmented people into our being?
I think, obviously you're much more of an expert on this. I'll do some of the theology, and then you can tell me what you think. But one of the things that we bring as Christians is the understanding that we're all damaged, that we live in a world that has broken its relationship with God in ways that damage all human beings. So there is no such thing as a perfect human being. There's only been one perfect human being, that was Jesus. And Jesus was perfect not by being, as I say, not by being invulnerable, but by not breaking his relationship with his Father. That's what makes a human being then, is a human being who can relate to God the Father. And that is not something that's natural to us, ordinary human beings, anymore. It's a gift. So it's God's reaching out for us in Jesus Christ, God's unwillingness, and in fact God's complete determination not to let go of us, so that in Jesus God reaches into the deepest, darkest, most painful, broken places in the world, so that we know God will be present there. And that's one thing then that I think we need to be saying to ourselves, those of us who think we don't have issues, don't have mental health issues, don't have health issues of other kinds, is that we are not perfect, that we receive our being, our humanity as gift from God, the God who reaches out for us, and that therefore we're called always to be doing that for each other, giving each other our humanity as gift through relating. And obviously that's a very easy thing to say about relating, and a nice, comfortable, cosy, warm word. But when people are severely broken by health issues, mental health and physical health issues, relating is much harder. And then that means that we really do have to imagine what it's like for God to try and relate to us, who are so far away and so unwilling and so selfish, and just begin to try and imaginatively and creatively enter that place where God is prepared to go on working with us, and try and do that for each other, go on holding out that gift of friendship and connection, however difficult it will be, because that's the God that we believe in, the God who will always hold on. And so when in Romans 8 Paul says nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, that's what he means. He means nothing. All the things that attack us and try to separate us, it can't be done, because God has gone into all those places that try to separate us from God, simply so that he will be there with us and for us. And that is something unique that we are saying as church, is that we don't have to earn our rights, our privileges, our personality, our being. All of that is given to us and held for us by God. And therefore that sort of nostalgia that must come in, longing to be the person we used to be, we don't need to do that. We look forward in hope to the restoration of our relationship with God, which will give us back the person that we are. It's not a sort of struggle to get back to where I was. It's a gradually walking forward step by step by step in faith with this community who are doing the same thing towards the people that we will be in Christ.
As we read the gospel accounts, we see Jesus coming across people who might appear to have severe mental illnesses, who are described as being demon-possessed or having impure spirits. And I know that I bring a particular set of eyes to reading them, because they sound to me like people with serious mental health problems, like people who I've come across in the course of my work, my experiences. And I'm struck that Jesus always knows the person, looks at them and knows who they are. And I'm struck too that what he does is he brings order from chaos. Is there anything we can learn and pick up on from the way that Jesus responded in those situations?
So one of the effects of whatever illness it is that Jesus is curing people from, one of the effects of it is to leave them outside community, is to put them on the margins, or indeed right outside their community. So Jesus is healing of them, restores them to community, and that is actually a big part of the healing and the restoration of the possibility of a real life after that, is to live again in their communities. And we don't want to put pressure on people who are suffering to feel that they have to be healed, because that becomes yet another kind of guilt-inducing thing, that somehow the prayers of the faithful community have not brought them healing if they're still struggling. But we do want to say that being restored to the community is always part of the process of hoping and walking forward and trusting. Not necessarily total healing now, though that can happen and we must pray for it, but continuing to belong in a community that knows you are a child of God and continues to love you even while you struggle. That is part of the healing that the church can offer.
It's a great opportunity now, in this moment, for the church to say, we can do something here. We're not experts, but we don't need to be, because we're experts in helping people to be rooted, having somewhere to belong, being communities of hope. And I think that's something so simple, but something that we can all do.
And I would guess that not all churches do feel capable of doing it. And so this would actually be a real opportunity for churches to rediscover our own nature and calling. Actually, if we reflect more on this kind of issue, what does it feel like to be somebody on the edge of society, somebody unloved, somebody marginalised? What can we as church do about that? It gives us back actually our real understanding of what church should be. There's a lovely phrase, I think it's Timothy Radcliffe, which says that God's centre is everywhere and his circumference is nowhere. God doesn't have edges. So people who feel on the edge of things, they're not on the edge of God. God is completely with them wherever they are. And so we who are trying to be God's people need to be people who don't have edges, don't have circumference, that our centre is wherever people need us to be. So I think it would be profoundly good for us as church, actually, to really explore these kind of issues and explore what it says about who we are and who we're called to be. for each other. And so I think that that we can feel that we can't manage this is beyond us, and some of it will be beyond us. We do need, as you say, to encourage people to take therapy, take medicine, take all the other gifts that are available for helping in this area. But simply being good neighbours to each other, we can manage that. That's not difficult. Simply continuing to see somebody struggling with mental health issues as a human being and a child of God and somebody deeply beloved, that we can manage, surely.
Yeah, well, I think so, and I'm a big champion of that. It's part of my cause to encourage us all to believe that, because a part of the problem with the stigma around mental health is that we think it's different to the other issues that we might readily pick up. And actually I would want to encourage everybody to know that it isn't, that we all have our issues, some look different to others, mental health problems are just one of them, and that we very much don't need to be experts to do the work. And if we feel like we need to call on an expert, then there is one somewhere readily available for all of us.
Great.
So thank you, Jane, for chatting with me and bringing us issues of identity, hope, and being rooted in a community with no edges, centred on Christ and what he has for us in the future.
Pleasure.